Brandon, a veteran, retreated to this island to control everything. He organized his supplies. He controlled the silence. But there was one thing he could not control. Every afternoon, when the tide receded, a gray-white German Shepherd crossed the sandbar. It completely ignored Brandon. It did not bark. It did not beg for food. It walked straight to the second rocking chair on the porch, sat down, and began its watch, staring intently at some unseen point on the horizon. At first, Brandon felt invaded, but then the soldier's instincts took over. He realized this was a ritual, a terrifyingly steadfast devotion. What was this dog waiting for? And why was its silent presence starting to make him feel more uneasy than his own nightmares? We hope you will support us by subscribing to our channel. The steady thrumming of the ferry's diesel engine vibrated through the steel deck, a low, monotonous hum that Brandon felt more in his bones than he heard with his ears. He stood at the stern, away from the other passengers, his back turned to the glassed-in cabin. He did not want comfort. He wanted the bite of the wind. The wind was sharp, smelling of salt, diesel, and the deep, cold green of the Pacific Northwest. He was 45 years old, but today he felt ancient. Brandon watched the mainland of Washington state dissolve into a hazy green-gray line. This ferry was just the first step. After it docked at Friday Harbor, he had another, smaller boat waiting, a chartered puddle jumper that would take him the final leg to the small, non-ferry serviced island he had inherited. The island? It was his last resort. He was a tall man, built with the lean, wiry strength of someone who had spent 2 decades in the Navy. His light brown hair was cut short, a disciplined military habit he refused to break, and it was heavily silvered at the temples. His face, which might have been kind once, was now a landscape of hard lines and shadows, softened only by a few days' growth of beard. He wore what had become his uniform in civilian life, a heavy plaid shirt of navy and gray over a faded thermal, worn denim jeans, and sturdy work boots. He was running, but not from the water. He was running toward the only thing that made sense anymore: silence. But the water was always there. The gray chop of the Salish Sea slapped against the hull, a rhythmic sound that reminded him of other sounds. The sound of water against a different hull, in a different ocean. The sharp, frantic slap of hands against metal. The chaos of a failed rescue. He squeezed his eyes shut. Joseph. The memory was immediate and suffocating. The scream of the helicopter's turbine, the icy black water, and the look in Joseph's eyes as the tether snapped. Brandon opened his eyes. The ferry churned on. He had come here, to the heart of the San Juan Islands, surrounded by the very element that haunted his waking nightmares. For one reason: Joshua. His grandfather Joshua had owned the cabin. He had been a veteran of a different war, a different time. He had been the only person Brandon had ever known who seemed truly at peace. When Joshua passed away 6 months ago, the cabin and its small parcel of land had become his. He had ignored the lawyer's letters for months until the apartment walls in Tacoma started to feel like a coffin. Now he was here. He was out of excuses. The rest of the journey was a blur of logistics. The transfer to the smaller boat, the jarring ride over the afternoon chop, and finally, the small rickety dock of his grandfather's island. The boat captain, a man with a face like cured leather, helped him unload his sparse belongings: 2 duffel bags, a footlocker, and 3 boxes of supplies. "You sure you're all right out here, mister?" the captain asked, securing the last box. "Only line you got is that old landline, and the cell service is spotty. I'll be back in 2 weeks with your next supply run." "I'll be fine," Brandon said. The words sounded flat, dead in the heavy, damp air. The captain nodded, seemingly satisfied, and cast off. The sputtering of the boat's small engine faded, and then, for the first time in his adult life, Brandon was surrounded by a silence so profound it was almost deafening. There was no traffic, no shouting, no sirens. Only the wind moving through the massive Douglas firs and the constant rhythmic wash of the waves on the small rocky beach below. The cabin was exactly as he remembered it from his last visit over a decade ago. It was small, made of dark, weathered cedar, with a simple metal roof. It smelled of damp wood, cold ashes, and salt. It was perfect. He spent the first hour carrying his gear up the path. His movements were economical, rigid. He organized his supplies in the small kitchen with the precision of a drill sergeant preparing for inspection. Everything had a place. Control? Control was the armor he wore against the chaos in his head. When the last box was stowed, he allowed himself to step onto the front porch. It was then he saw them, tucked under the eaves, protected from the worst of the rain. 2 rocking chairs. They were made of the same weathered cedar as the cabin, grayed by time and salt. They were old, their arms smoothed by years of use. They sat side by side, angled slightly toward each other, looking out over the water. Brandon stopped. This was new, or rather, old. He hadn't noticed them on his last visit. He ran a hand over the back of one. It was Joshua's chair. He knew it instinctively. But the other? They were positioned too intimately to be casual. They were a testament to a long-held ritual, a silent statement of a friendship so deep it had become part of the cabin itself. He felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Envy, perhaps. He who had comrades but no friends, who had pushed everyone away, was now an intruder on a conversation that had ended years ago. He spent the next 2 days falling into a new, harsh routine. He rose before the sun, drank instant coffee, and worked. He repaired a loose shutter. He cleared the thick brush from the path to the dock. He chopped wood, the rhythmic percussion of the axe, a welcome distraction. But the sound was always there, the relentless whispering surf. Shh. It was the sound of the ocean that had taken Joseph, and it never stopped. The beauty of the place, the eagles turning circles overhead, the deep emerald green of the forest, the misty mornings, felt like a mockery. It was on the 3rd afternoon that his fortress was breached. The weather had been clear, and the tide was the lowest he had ever seen it. It exposed a long, glistening spine of wet sand and rock, a natural causeway that connected his small island to the larger inhabited island nearly a half-mile across the strait. Brandon was inside, wiping the grime from the cabin's main window, when a movement caught his eye. He froze. Something was walking across the sandbar. It was a dog. Brandon's hand tightened on the rag. He had chosen this island for its isolation. No neighbors, no visitors. A dog meant a person. He watched, his irritation rising, but no person followed. The dog walked alone, its paws sinking slightly into the wet sand. It was a German shepherd, but not the black and tan he was used to seeing. This dog was a pale wash of gray and silver white, like the fog that clung to the water. It was large, but it moved with the deliberate, careful gait of an older animal. The dog reached his island, climbed the rocky beach, and disappeared onto the path leading to the cabin. Brandon's heart began a low, anxious pounding. He stepped back from the window, his hand moving instinctively to his hip, where nothing had been for years. He felt invaded. He heard the quiet click of claws on the wooden porch. He held his breath. There was no barking, no scratching at the door. Just silence. Slowly, carefully, Brandon moved to the door and peered through the screen. The German shepherd was not looking at the cabin. It had walked directly past the screen door, past Joshua's chair, and had stopped at the second rocking chair. It stood there for a long moment, its noble head tilted slightly. Then, with a quiet sigh, the dog lay down beside the empty chair. It positioned itself with practiced ease, its body aligned with the chair's runners, its gaze pointed directly out to sea. Brandon stood behind the screen, paralyzed. The dog, Finn, was not a stray. It was not lost. It was on a mission. It ignored Brandon completely, as if he were just another piece of furniture. It lay perfectly still, a silent silver-gray sentinel, guarding an empty seat, watching the same waves that Brandon could not bear to see. Brandon remained motionless behind the screen door for a long time, watching the silver-gray dog. Finn. He didn't know the dog's name yet, but the image of him was seared into his mind. The animal just lay there, a statue of patient loyalty, its gaze fixed on the gray, empty horizon. It was an invasion. This was his island, his sanctuary, chosen specifically because the only footprints on it should be his own. He waited for the inevitable. A bark, a whine, a scratch at the door demanding food or attention. Nothing. The only sounds were the ones he was trying to escape, the wind humming through the fir trees and the incessant, hissing wash of the waves. Brandon checked his watch, a habit he couldn't break, though time had ceased to have meaning here. 4 o'clock. He looked at the water. The tide had turned. He could see the water beginning to creep back, slowly drowning the glistening sandbar that connected his island to the larger one. As if sensing the shift in the sea, the old dog stirred. He lifted his head, his ears twitching. He looked at the empty rocking chair beside him, and for a second, Brandon thought he saw the dog nudge the wooden runner with his nose. Finn rose, his movements stiff in the hind legs, betraying his age. He stretched, first his front legs, then his back. He gave one last, long look at the chair, then turned. He walked past the screen door, again ignoring Brandon's presence completely, and made his way down the path. His paws were silent on the pine needles. Brandon watched as Finn reached the sandbar, his pace steady, and walked back across the narrowing strip of land, disappearing into the trees on the other side, just as the last patch of sand vanished beneath the rising water. Brandon let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. The porch felt empty now, and the silence that returned was heavier, defined by the absence of the visitor. The next day, Brandon was determined to re-establish his territory. He woke, drank his bitter coffee, and set about his work. He had found Joshua's old splitting maul, and he began attacking the rounds of seasoned wood stacked near the shed. The heavy percussion of the steel striking the wood was satisfying. It was a rhythm he could control. He focused on the task, splitting log after log, the physical exertion a welcome drug. He tried to ignore the tide, but the ocean would not be ignored. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the water receding. He saw the sandbar begin to emerge, slick and brown from the sea. He paused, his axe resting on a log. He waited. It was almost 3 in the afternoon, and just as the path became fully walkable, the silver-gray shape appeared. This time, Brandon was ready. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve and marched up to the cabin, planting himself on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest. He would face this intruder. Finn walked up the path, his pace exactly the same as the day before. He seemed unsurprised to see Brandon standing there. "Hey," Brandon said. His voice was rough, grating from disuse. "This is private property." The dog stopped. He looked up at Brandon. The gaze was not fearful, nor was it aggressive. It was calm, intelligent, and utterly indifferent. Finn looked at Brandon as if he were a rock or a tree, a simple obstacle in the landscape. After a moment, the dog simply walked around him, stepped onto the porch, and lay down in his designated spot beside the empty rocking chair. Brandon was speechless. He had been evaluated, dismissed, and ignored, all in the span of 5 seconds. "You can't just stay here," Brandon insisted, feeling ridiculous. Finn let out a long, quiet sigh, the sound barely audible over the wind. He rested his heavy muzzle on his front paws and turned his head, resuming his watch over the sea. Frustration, hot and sharp, pricked at Brandon. This was an uncontrolled variable. This was a breach. His entire life in the Navy, especially his time in EOD, had been about managing threats, controlling the environment, and neutralizing variables. This dog was a variable he could not neutralize. He retreated inside, slamming the cabin door with more force than necessary. The resulting clap echoed in the quiet air. The dog did not even flinch. On the 3rd and 4th day, something in Brandon shifted. The irritation remained, but a new instinct took over, the soldier's analytical mind. He stopped seeing the dog as an intruder and started seeing him as a puzzle. He found a small notebook and a pen in one of Joshua's drawers. He began to track the pattern. He noted the time of the tide. He noted the exact moment Finn appeared. It was always within the same 10-minute window. He noted the dog's behavior. Entry 1. No deviation from path. Entry 2. Does not respond to verbal commands or presence of occupant. Entry 3. Does not seek food, water, or shelter even when a light rain began to fall. Entry 4. Objective is singular. Guard the second chair. Brandon sat inside, watching. He recognized this. This was not the behavior of a simple pet. This was the behavior of a soldier. This was discipline. The dog was on a mission, bound by a routine so powerful that nothing, not a stranger, not the weather, not his own aging body, could break it. This was loyalty. A concept Brandon had once understood but had long since buried along with Joseph. He began to respect the dog, not as a companion, but as a fellow veteran. This dog, this pilgrim, as Brandon had begun to think of him, was holding a post. He was standing watch for someone who was clearly never coming back. Brandon's own days had been a gray, shapeless void since his arrival, a meaningless succession of sunrises and sunsets. He had tried to fill them with chores, but the chores were just busy work, a way to keep the memories at bay. Now his days had a structure. His existence was no longer aimless. It was defined by the tide. His internal clock reset itself. There was the time before Finn and the time after Finn. The dog's arrival was the main event, the only reliable marker in a sea of empty hours. On the 5th day, Brandon didn't try to block the porch. He sat at the small kitchen table, cleaning his tools, and simply watched the dog arrive. Finn took his position. The two of them existed in a strange, silent truce. Brandon, the hermit, hiding from the world, and Finn, the sentinel, guarding a memory. Brandon looked at the dog, then at the empty chair beside him. He realized, with a sudden sharp pang, that the dog was doing a better job of honoring the past than he was. Finn was facing the ocean, facing the memory, standing his ground. Brandon was just hiding. He looked down at his own hands, steady and strong, hands that had disarmed complex explosives, but had failed to hold onto his friend. Outside, the silent gray soldier kept his watch, and for the first time since he had arrived, Brandon did not feel entirely alone. Finn's visit that afternoon followed the same unwavering script. He arrived with the receding tide, took his position by the second chair, and commenced his silent watch. Brandon sat inside, cleaning a small rusted hand plane he'd found in the workshop. He worked, and the dog watched. When the tide began to turn, Finn rose. He gave his customary brief nudge to the chair's runner and departed across the sandbar. Brandon was left alone in the cabin, but the presence of the dog lingered. The silence was louder now. The mystery of the animal's ritual had taken root in his mind. It was no longer just an intrusion, it was a question that demanded an answer. His gaze kept returning to the two rocking chairs on the porch. One belonged to Joshua. The other, the one Finn guarded, belonged to a ghost. Brandon was a man who needed order. He needed facts. This mystery, this unanswered question, was a form of chaos, and he could not let it rest. He put down the hand plane, and his grandfather had not been a tidy man, but he had been organized in his own way. The cabin was a cluttered, dusty archive of his life. If there was an answer, it was in here. Driven by this new purpose, Brandon began to clean. It was less about sanitation and more about excavation. He started in the small living area. He emptied shelves filled with old paperbacks, their pages swollen and yellowed by the damp sea air. He found tins of old tobacco, bundles of letters tied with twine, and jars filled with forgotten buttons and fishing hooks. He worked with a systematic, almost frantic energy. This was a mission. He swept the dust from the floorboards, wiped the grime from the windows, and scrubbed the small soot-stained fireplace. But his eyes were always scanning, searching for a clue. Finally, he reached his grandfather's desk. It was a heavy piece of dark wood, piled high with nautical charts, old ledgers, and shipping manifests from decades past. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a folded oilskin map, he found a small wooden box. It was not locked. Inside, beneath a collection of service medals and brass compasses, was a stack of old photographs. He took them to the table, the light from the window falling across the sepia and faded color prints. He saw images of fishing boats, massive trees, and a younger Joshua in his Navy uniform from the 1950s. He looked strange to Brandon, a boy playing dress-up. Then, near the bottom of the stack, he found it. The photograph was faded, its corners soft and rounded, but the image was clear. It was the porch, it was the two rocking chairs, and they were occupied. He recognized his grandfather Joshua instantly, though he looked younger than Brandon remembered him, perhaps in his late 60s. His hair was still more pepper than salt, and his face was split by a wide, easy grin. In the second chair, the one Finn guarded, sat another man. He was a stranger to Brandon, built like a barrel, with a thick white mustache and eyes that crinkled at the corners. He, too, was smiling, a pipe held in one hand, the other resting on his knee. They were both dressed in the simple, practical clothes of islanders, wool sweaters and denim. They were leaning toward each other, caught in the middle of a shared laugh, the very picture of lifelong companionship and peace. Brandon sat down heavily on the stool. His throat felt tight. He turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back in Joshua's familiar looping handwriting were two words, Joshua and Christopher. 1999. Christopher. He was the ghost. This was Christopher's chair. Brandon looked from the smiling faces in the photo to the empty, silent chairs on the porch. This dog, Finn, was not guarding a piece of furniture. He was guarding his master's place. He was still showing up for a meeting that would never happen again, a testament to a bond that even death had not broken. Brandon felt a profound, aching loneliness. He looked at the joy captured in the old photograph, a simple, shared peace he had never known. His own service had not forged bonds like that. It had only shattered them. He put the photograph down on the table and did not move for a long time, watching as the sun set and the cabin filled with shadows. That night, the photograph haunted his sleep. The image of peace served only to sharpen the image of its opposite. He fell into the familiar nightmare, the one that never left him, the one that had driven him to this island. It always started with the cold, a deep, penetrating cold that the thickest gear could not stop. He was on the deck of the fast response cutter, the world a chaos of black water and slashing, icy rain. The noise was overwhelming, the high-pitched, desperate whine of the helicopter's turbine fighting the gale, the roar of the ocean, and the sharp, urgent shouts over the comms. He was the EOD tech, but this was a rescue, a salvage gone wrong, and everyone was outside their specialty. The trawler had capsized. He saw the strobe light of the life raft rising and falling on impossible waves. He was on the winch, his hands numb, trying to secure the harness. Joseph was beside him, his best friend, his swim buddy, the man who was supposed to be the best man at his wedding. "Got him!" Joseph yelled, his voice barely audible as he leaned far over the rail, grappling for the man in the water. And then the sound. It was not a loud explosion. It was a dull, sickening groan of metal under stress, a sound Brandon knew better than his own heartbeat. The mounting bracket for the rescue winch, compromised by the violent pitching of the deck. He saw it happen in agonizing slow motion. The groan, and then the sharp metallic snap as the bracket tore free. The heavy winch assembly, unsecured, swung loose. It struck Joseph with brutal, indifferent force. There was no scream, just the sickening sound of the impact. Joseph was gone, swept overboard into the churning black water before Brandon could even form his name. Brandon lunged, his gloved hand catching Joseph's wrist. The grip was wrong, slick with freezing spray. He saw Joseph's eyes, wide with shock, not fear. He saw his mouth open. "Brandon!" And then he slipped. The glove, the weight, the water. Joseph was torn from his grasp. He vanished. He just vanished. Brandon woke up with a choked cry, his body rigid, tangled in the damp sheets. He was in the cabin. It was pitch black, silent, save for his own ragged breathing and the pounding of his heart against his ribs. The nightmare was still there, clinging to him, the feeling of Joseph's wrist slipping through his fingers as real as the wooden floor beneath his feet. He was panicking. The silence of the room was too much like the silence after Joseph disappeared. He threw the sheets off, his breath coming in short, gasping sobs. The cabin walls were closing in. He staggered to the window, fumbling with the latch, needing air, needing anything other than the memory. He pushed the window open, and the cold, damp air hit his face. He looked out. The sky was a pale pre-dawn gray. The tide was out. The sandbar was a faint, luminous ribbon in the darkness. And on the porch, a shadow detached itself from the other shadows. It was Finn. He had arrived on the early tide before the sun. He had already taken his post. Brandon watched the dog. Finn sat perfectly still, his profile rigid, his gaze fixed on the gray line of the horizon. He was the picture of unwavering discipline. He was not shaken by the dark or the cold or the ghosts. He was simply there. Brandon leaned his forehead against the cool glass. He watched the steady, quiet rise and fall of the dog's chest. He inhaled. He exhaled. The rhythm of the dog's breathing became an anchor. The nightmare's chaos began to recede, beaten back by the dog's absolute, unshakable stillness. The panic subsided, leaving only the familiar, dull ache of grief. He stood there for an hour, watching the silver-gray soldier stand guard in the dawn, until his own heart stopped racing. The nightmare about Joseph left a metallic taste in Brandon's mouth that lasted for days. But the vision of Finn on the porch, a stoic silver shadow in the pre-dawn dark, had done something else. It had settled him. It had given him an anchor. His new life on the island became a two-part rhythm, the chaos in his head and the discipline on his porch. Finn continued his daily pilgrimage. He would appear as the sandbar revealed itself, walk past Brandon, who now simply nodded at the dog, a silent greeting between soldiers, and take his post by Christopher's chair. This routine might have continued indefinitely, a silent truce between the hermit and the pilgrim, had it not been for the simple, mundane demands of survival. Brandon's supplies ran out. He had been putting it off, rationing his coffee until it was a weak brown water, eating the last of the canned stew. But now, the cupboards were bare. He looked at the small aluminum skiff tied to the dock. It had belonged to Joshua, equipped with an old but reliable outboard motor. He had to go to the main island. He had to cross the water. He stood on the dock, the wind pulling at his plaid shirt. The half-mile strait looked a mile wide, the water a cold, dark green. His entire body tensed. Every instinct screamed at him to stay on solid ground. The sound of the small waves lapping against the pilings was a low, mocking hiss, reminding him of the black ocean that had stolen Joseph. "It's not the same," he told himself, his voice sounding hollow in his own head. "It's a boat. You've spent 20 years on boats." But this was different. Then he had a mission, a crew, a purpose. Now he was just a man, alone, trying to buy coffee. He forced his body into the skiff. His movements were stiff, unnatural. He unhooked the mooring line, his knuckles white. He yanked the starter cord, and the motor sputtered to life with a choked, rattling sound. He put it in gear and steered away from his island, his sanctuary. He did not look down. He kept his eyes fixed on the approaching dock of the main island, his jaw set so tight his teeth ached. The journey took less than 10 minutes, but by the time he tied off the skiff, his shirt was damp with cold sweat. The main island's town was little more than a single paved road, a post office, and one central hub, the Island Mercantile. A small bell attached to the door announced his entry with a cheerful, tinny jingle. The store was a cluttered, warm, wonderful-smelling place. It smelled of coffee beans, fresh-cut lumber, rubber boots, and cinnamon. It was the smell of a life he was no longer part of. Behind the counter, a woman with bright, curly red hair was sorting mail. She looked to be in her late 50s, her face full of energy. She wore a flannel shirt and a bright blue vest. "Well, hello there," she said, her voice booming with confidence. Brandon just nodded, grabbing one of the wire baskets. He moved through the narrow aisles with military efficiency. Coffee, canned beans, rice, kerosene. He piled the items in his basket, his focus absolute. He wanted to be in and out in under 5 minutes. "You must be Joshua's grandson," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Brandon stopped. He turned slowly. "Brandon," he said. "Madison," the woman replied, beaming, as if they were old friends. "I run this place. Knew your grandfather well. We all did?" She leaned on the counter. "Heard you were coming. Didn't expect you to be quite so reclusive. You've been out on that rock for 2 weeks, haven't you?" Brandon placed his items on the counter. The heavy rustle of the bags was the only sound he made. He just wanted to pay. "Not much of a talker, eh? Just like Joshua," she laughed, not unkindly. "But he always had a story for me. We all miss him. And poor Christopher, too. It's been a hard season for the islands." Brandon's head snapped up. Christopher. The name from the photograph. Madison noticed his sudden, sharp attention. "Oh, yes. Terrible shame. Christopher Jensen. He passed, must be 3, maybe 4 months ago now. Heart just gave out. He and your grandfather were thick as thieves, you know. Every single day, one of them was crossing that sandbar to sit on the porch with the other. Rain or shine. For 30 years, I suppose." She began ringing up his items, her voice softening. "Now it's just his granddaughter, Jessica, left to handle everything. She's the artist, you know? The one with the workshop by the point. A lovely girl, but she's got her hands full. Especially now that she's inherited that big, loyal dog of his." Brandon felt a jolt, as if a final piece of a complex device had just locked into place. Madison bagged his supplies. "She's been trying to keep him home, but that dog, Finn, he just won't have it. Still makes the trip. Every day. Looking for Christopher, I guess. Loyal to a fault, that one." Finn. The name was simple, strong. Brandon paid, his hands moving stiffly. He grabbed his 2 heavy bags. "You take care of yourself out there, Brandon," Madison called after him. "Don't be a stranger for so long." Brandon was already out the door, the bell jingling his retreat. He had the facts. The ghost had a name. The chair belonged to Christopher. The dog was Finn. The guardian was Jessica. His path back to the skiff took him past the workshop Madison had mentioned. It was set back from the road, near the rocky point, overlooking the water. It was an old boathouse, converted, with large windows and pieces of driftwood, and twisted metal leaning against the outer walls. And there, on the path, was Finn. The tide had just turned, and the dog had clearly just returned from his pilgrimage to Brandon's Island. He looked tired, his gray muzzle damp. A young woman stood on the workshop steps, holding the door open. She was perhaps in her early 30s, with dark, wavy hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore paint-stained jeans and a heavy wool sweater. Her face was pale, her eyes etched with a deep, weary sadness. This was Jessica. "Finn," she was saying, her voice gentle but strained. "Come on, boy. Come inside. It's cold." Finn looked at her, then looked back toward the sandbar, letting out a low, quiet whine. He was torn. His duty was on the island, but his new master was here. Jessica rubbed her temples, looking defeated. Then she saw Brandon. He was just standing there, 20 yards away, a tall, imposing figure in a plaid shirt, holding 2 grocery bags, staring. Jessica tensed, a flash of defensiveness in her eyes. "Can I help you?" Brandon felt the familiar, awkward stiffness seize him. He was terrible at this. At people. "No," he grunted. "I'm on the other island. Joshua's." Understanding washed over Jessica's face, immediately followed by a wave of deep embarrassment. Oh no, I am so sorry." She stepped off the porch and walked toward him, her hands twisting together. "About Finn," she said, gesturing helplessly at the dog. He's been bothering you, hasn't he?" I've tried. I've tried everything, but he slips out. He was my grandfather's, Christopher's. They had a routine. He doesn't understand." Brandon looked from the exhausted woman to the loyal dog. He saw the same grief, the same unbreakable bond he had seen in the photograph. He had expected to feel anger at this invasion. He felt only a strange, quiet recognition. "He's not a problem," Brandon said. The words came out rough, but they were true. Jessica stopped, looking surprised. "He's not? I was so worried. I thought you'd be angry. He's trespassing." Brandon looked at Finn, who was now watching him with that same calm, analytical gaze. Brandon thought of the nightmare, of the panic, and of the silver-gray shape that had pulled him back. "He minds his post," Brandon said. It was an odd phrase, military in its precision. Jessica didn't seem to fully understand, but she heard the complete lack of animosity in his voice. She heard the dismissal. "Oh," she said, a small, fragile sliver of relief in her voice. "Well, thank you. Still, I'll try harder." Brandon gave a short, stiff nod. He turned and walked away, back toward his skiff, back toward the water he hated. He had the complete intelligence report. The mission of the Pilgrim was no longer a mystery. It was a memorial. A shift in the world woke him. It was not a sound, but a change in the pressure of the air. The silence on the island was wrong. It was too heavy, too still. Brandon got up from his bunk and went to the window. The sun was not yet visible, but the pre-dawn light was a sick, bruised, yellowish gray. The water in the strait was not moving. It was flat, oily, and expectant. He went to the small, battery-powered weather radio on the kitchen counter, a relic from Joshua's time. He twisted the knob. A burst of static filled the room, followed by the cold, robotic voice of the automated forecast. A significant atmospheric river event, moving faster than previously projected. All marine craft should seek safe harbor. Gale-force winds shifting to severe gales by midday. Coastal flooding and dangerous, unpredictable tides are expected. Brandon switched it off, the silence returning, now filled with a new official dread. His eyes went immediately to the sandbar. It was just after 6 in the morning. The tide was at its absolute lowest, a pale ribbon of land stretching across the dark water. And right on cue, a silver-gray shape appeared on the far side. Finn. Brandon felt a surge of anxiety, sharp and unfamiliar. "No," he muttered. "Not today. Go back." But the dog was too far to hear, his pace as steady and disciplined as ever. He was a soldier walking into a known trap. He was following his orders, his ritual, while the world was preparing to tear itself apart. Brandon watched, helpless, as Finn made the crossing. The dog trotted up the path and onto the porch. But today, his ritual was broken. He did not immediately lie down. He stood by Christopher's chair, his head low, his body tense. He let out a low, almost inaudible whine, his ears flat against his skull. He could smell the barometric pressure dropping. He could feel the change in the air. He looked back at the sandbar, then at the empty chair, clearly distressed. But his loyalty, his duty, kept him there. He was trembling, but he would not abandon his post. Brandon watched through the window, his own gut tightening. He was a fool, a damned old fool of a dog. A new sound, sharp and alien, shattered the silence inside the cabin. It was the telephone. The high-pitched, piercing ring of the old rotary phone on the wall made Brandon jump. He stared at it. It was a relic, part of the old landline the boat captain had mentioned. He hadn't touched it. He didn't even know if it worked. It rang again, a shrill, demanding sound. It could only be one person. He snatched the heavy black receiver off the hook, his voice a low growl. "Yeah." "Mr. Brandon?" The voice on the other end was high, fast, and breathless with panic. "It's Jessica, Christopher's granddaughter. I'm so sorry to call." "What is it?" he stated. "Finn, he got out." He could hear the wind howling on her end of the line, and something else. Was she crying? I heard the storm warning. I tried to keep him in. I locked the door, but he broke the latch. He threw himself against it until it splintered. He just ran. Is he there? Did he cross? Please. Brandon looked through the window. Finn was on the porch, huddled against the cabin wall, but still guarding the chair. He's here. A choked sob of relief came through the line. Oh, thank God. But the storm. They say it's coming faster. The radio said the tides. He won't be able to get back, will he? He'll be trapped. The tide's already turning, Brandon said, his voice flat. The bar will be gone in an hour. He's trapped. Oh, no, she whispered, her voice cracking. Please, I can't. He's all I have left of him. And he's terrified of the wind. When it gets bad, he panics. He'll try to run. He'll fall off the rocks. Can you let him inside, just until it passes? Please, I'm begging you. Inside? Brandon looked around his small, controlled space, his bunk perfectly made, his few supplies perfectly aligned. This was his fortress, the only place the chaos couldn't reach him. Letting an animal in, a wet, terrified animal, was a breach of the highest order. It was letting the outside world in. He looked at Finn. The dog was shivering, his gaze darting between the angry sky and the empty chair. A soldier, terrified, but holding his post. You don't leave a man in the field when the artillery is coming. Brandon let out a long breath. The sound was rough like sandpaper. I'll take care of him. Thank you, Jessica sobbed. Thank you so much. The line filled with a deafening burst of static, followed by a dial tone. She was gone. Brandon hung the receiver back on its hook. He was alone again, but now he had a new mission. He had maybe an hour. But the storm, just as Jessica had said, was faster. It hit the island not as a gradual rain, but as a sudden, violent assault. The sky, which had been a sick yellow, turned a deep, bruised purple. The wind did not rise. It arrived. It struck the cabin with a solid, physical blow, and the old structure groaned in protest. A high-pitched shriek began, the sound of the wind forcing its way through the needles of the giant firs. And then came the rain. It was a horizontal wall of water, hitting the windows with the sound of thrown gravel. Brandon went to the door and looked out. The ocean was unrecognizable. It was no longer a series of waves, but a chaotic, churning mass of white and gray foam. The wind was ripping the tops off the waves, sending spray so high it lashed the cabin windows. He looked at the sandbar. It was gone. It had not just been covered, it had been obliterated. A torrent of violent, angry water now separated him from the main island. There was no escape. Finn was no longer sitting. He was huddled against the cabin wall, pressed as low to the wood as he could get, his body shaking violently. He was soaked to the skin, his silver fur plastered to his frame. He let out a low, terrified whine as another gust of wind hit the porch, sending a sheet of water over him. Brandon watched him for a long, hard minute. He saw the terror in the animal's eyes, but he also saw the refusal to move from his post. He couldn't leave him out there. Brandon unlatched the door. The wind instantly ripped it from his grasp, slamming it open against the cabin's outer wall with a percussive crash. The storm roared into the small room, sending papers flying. "Finn!" Brandon shouted over the noise. The dog scrambled to his feet, his claws scraping on the wet wood, looking at the open door with wide, panicked eyes. "In!" Brandon yelled, using the sharp, single-word command of his old life. "Now!" The dog didn't hesitate. He scrambled past Brandon into the cabin, bringing the storm with him. He smelled of ozone, of the deep, cold salt of the sea, and of wet fur. Brandon put his shoulder against the door and shoved, fighting the incredible pressure of the wind. He forced it closed and, with a final metallic thud, threw the heavy deadbolt. Silence. The cabin was suddenly intensely quiet. The roar of the storm was muffled, a distant, angry giant. The room was small. Too small. Finn huddled by the door, dripping a large puddle onto the clean floor, shaking from head to tail. His eyes, wide and luminous, darted around the new, strange space, finally resting on Brandon. Brandon stood on the other side of the room, by the cold fireplace, his arms crossed over his chest. His fortress had been breached. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was unnaturally loud, a heavy metallic thud that seemed to seal them in a tomb. Outside, the storm had ceased to be weather. It had become a physical, screaming entity. The wind no longer whistled. It roared, a deep, resonant bass note that vibrated in Brandon's chest. The cabin, which had stood for decades, was now groaning like a ship in a heavy sea, the timbers straining against the assault. Brandon stood by the cold fireplace, his back to the wall. His heart was hammering against his ribs, not from fear of the storm, but from the violation of his sanctuary. Across the small room by the door, Finn stood in a rapidly growing puddle of seawater and rain. The dog was shaking violently, his silver-gray fur plastered to his thin frame, his head low, ears pinned flat against his skull. He whined, a low, terrified sound that was barely audible over the howl of the wind. They were two statues on opposite sides of the room, a man and a dog, both trapped by forces they could not control. The light began to fail. Though it was only late afternoon, the storm clouds were so thick and black that the world outside the windows dissolved into a churning, watery darkness. The cabin was plunged into a deep, oppressive twilight. Brandon's senses, already heightened by years of specialized training, went into overdrive. But now, they were working against him. The storm was a total sensory assault. The sound. It was the sound that unlocked the past. The low, constant roar of the wind was the sound of the ocean, the same sound that had filled his ears the night Joseph died. The high-pitched, tearing shriek of the wind as it ripped through the furs was the sound of metal. The high-torque whine of the rescue winch, the sound of the bracket straining just before it snapped. And the impacts. Every few seconds, a piece of debris, a branch, a chunk of ice, a loose shingle, would be ripped free and thrown against the cabin. Each impact was a dull, sickening thud, like a body hitting the deck, like the winch assembly striking Joseph. Brandon's breathing became shallow. He could taste salt in the back of his throat. He retreated to his bunk, the farthest corner from the windows, and sat down, his back pressed hard against the solid wood wall. It was a defensive posture, a reflex. He was taking cover. He glanced at the rotary phone on the wall. It was silent, lifeless. The line was dead. They were completely cut off. Then came the percussion. A deep, resonant boom shook the cabin, so powerful the floor vibrated. It was the first real peal of thunder rolling in from the sea, and it felt like artillery. Finn yelped, a sharp, terrified sound, and scrambled away from the door, his claws slipping on the wooden floor. He pressed himself against the wall under the kitchen counter, his body trembling so hard Brandon could see it from across the room. "It's just thunder," Brandon whispered. But he wasn't talking to the dog. He was talking to himself. Because the thunder was not just thunder, it was the sound of the impact, the sound of the deck plates shuddering, the deck of the cutter, the icy rain, the water. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images were already there, projected onto the back of his eyelids. Another boom, this one closer, rattled the glass in the window frames. Finn bolted from under the counter and ran to the door. He stood on his hind legs, his front paws scratching frantically at the wood, his whines escalating into a desperate, panicked cry. He was trapped, and his animal mind could not comprehend why the door would not open. Brandon watched, detached, his own panic rising in sync with the dog's. He wants out, Brandon thought, and I want out too. But there was nowhere to go. The cabin was no longer a cabin. It was the heaving deck of the ship. The groaning of the wood was the groaning of the hull. The darkness was the same impossible, freezing night. "Steady," he breathed, gripping the edge of his narrow bunk. Steady. He was back there. He could feel the freezing spray on his face. He could feel the slick, terrifying slip of the harness. He could feel Joseph's wrist. I had him. I had him. The memory was so total, so absolute, that his own hand, resting on his knee, spasmed, clenching into a fist as if trying to hold on to the friend he had lost. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, no." A violent crack, louder than the thunder, exploded just outside the cabin. It was the sound of a massive tree branch splitting, a sound like a rifle shot next to his ear. That was the sound of the winch bracket snapping. It broke them both. Finn screamed, a high-pitched, agonizing sound of pure terror. He abandoned the door and scrambled across the room, desperate, seeking any corner. For Brandon, the sound was the final trigger. He was gone. He gasped, his lungs seizing, as if he had been plunged into the icy water himself. He was no longer in the cabin. He was in the ocean, in the dark, and Joseph was sinking, gone, just out of reach. He couldn't breathe. His vision tunneled. He was dying. He was in the middle of a full-blown flashback, drowning in his own memory, 1,000 miles from shore. And then something touched him. It was not the icy water. It was not the memory. It was a wet, cold nose pressing insistently against his clenched fist. Brandon flinched, a violent full-body jerk. His eyes flew open. He gasped for air, and this time the air was the close, musty air of the cabin, not the open, salt-filled air of the sea. Finn was there. The dog, in his blind panic, had sought the only other living thing in the room. He was shaking, his body pressed against Brandon's leg, his muzzle shoved hard against his hand. The dog was terrified, not of a memory, but of the present, of the immediate, tangible threat of the storm. Brandon stared at the silver-gray head. His own body was still vibrating, his heart racing, the nightmare still clinging to him. But the physical, present-tense touch of the dog was an anchor. It was real. This was not the ghost of Joseph. This was a dog. Finn whined again, a low, pleading sound, and pushed his head harder against Brandon's hand. Brandon looked at his own fist, still clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He was shaking. The dog was shaking. Two lonely, terrified creatures trapped in a box, while the world tried to break in. Slowly, fighting the tremor in his arm, Brandon uncurled his fingers. He let his hand rest, palm down, on the dog's shivering head. Finn's shaking did not stop, but he leaned into the touch, a desperate, silent plea for reassurance. "Easy," Brandon said. The word was a hoarse croak, the first one he had spoken in hours. "Easy, soldier. We're holding fast." He didn't know if he was talking to the dog or to himself. He did not invite the dog onto the bunk. He did not pet him. He simply kept his hand there, a point of contact. Finn, accepting the fragile truce, sank to the floor, his body pressed against the bunk, his head resting on Brandon's boot. Outside, the storm raged on, screaming for entry. Inside, Brandon sat upright, his back to the wall, his hand on the dog's head. He did not sleep. He just endured. He was a lighthouse, and the dog was the rock he was built on. Together, they waited for the dawn. The night had been a long, dark siege, but all sieges eventually break. Brandon had not moved. His hand, resting on Finn's head, had gone numb, a dull ache in his shoulder radiating down his arm. But he had not moved. He and the dog had held the line together, a two-man fire team in a foxhole, waiting out the barrage. The barrage, in the last hour, had lessened. The deep, percussive impacts of debris hitting the cabin had stopped. The constant, high-pitched shriek of the wind had died down to a low, guttural moan. The cabin floor was no longer vibrating. Finn stirred under his hand. The dog lifted his head, his breathing no longer the shallow, terrified panting of the night. He was still tense, but the panic had passed. Brandon exhaled, the sound a ragged tear in the quiet. He was exhausted. Every muscle ached from being held rigid for 8 solid hours. The nightmare, the memory of Joseph, had been kept at bay, but it was just outside the door, waiting in the half-light. He looked at the window. A pale, sickly gray light was filtering through. It was near dawn, and it was quiet. The silence was sudden, profound, and deeply unnatural. It was the silence of a held breath, the pause after the artillery lifts, just before the ground assault. Brandon knew this quiet. It was the eye of the storm. "It's a lull," he whispered, as much to himself as to the dog. "Just a lull." Finn rose to his feet, his joints stiff. He stretched, his claws clicking on the wooden floor. He walked to the door, not to scratch, but just to stand, his nose pressed to the crack. He whined, a low, questioning sound. "Easy, soldier. We're not clear yet," Brandon said. He stood up, his own legs unsteady, and moved to the window to assess the damage. The world was unrecognizable. It was a landscape of devastation. The giant fir trees he had admired were savaged, their branches snapped and scattered like twigs. The ground was a soup of mud, pine needles, and seawater. The wind was still present, a heavy, powerful force, but it was no longer screaming. Finn whined again. This time, it was different. It was not a sound of fear. It was a sound of agitation. Brandon turned. The dog was no longer at the door. He was at the window on the far side of the cabin, the one that faced the rocky northern point of the island. He was standing on his hind legs, his paws on the sill, staring out into the gray light. Then a deep, heavy growl rumbled in his chest. "Finn, settle," Brandon commanded, his voice rough. The dog ignored him. He dropped to all fours and ran back to the front door, scratching at it, not with the high-pitched panic of the night, but with an urgent, desperate demand. He let out a single, sharp bark, a sound that seemed to shake the small room. He ran back to the window, then back to the door. This was not fear. This was an alert. Brandon's fatigue vanished, replaced by a sudden, cold shot of adrenaline. The dog wasn't trying to escape the cabin. He was trying to get to something. "What is it?" Brandon said, his voice sharp. "What do you hear?" Finn responded with another, more frantic bark, and threw his body against the door. He was signaling. He was on watch, and he had spotted something. Brandon looked at the door, then back at the dog, who was now fixated on the wall, in the direction of the rocky point. The point. Brandon had avoided that part of the island. It was a treacherous, bare spine of black basalt rock that jutted out into the strait, taking the full force of the open water. It was the place that most resembled the deck of the cutter, the place where the sound of the ocean was loudest, and it was exactly where Finn was trying to go. "All right," Brandon said, his decision made. He was a fool to go out in a lull, but he was a bigger fool to ignore an alert from a fellow soldier. He moved with grim purpose. He pulled on his heavy oilskin rain gear, the stiff material cold against his skin. He jammed his feet into his work boots. He found Joshua's old, heavy, rubber-encased flashlight and shoved it into his deep pocket. He grabbed his medical kit, a habit he'd never broken, and a coil of rope from the shed, which he looped over his shoulder. He went to the door and put his hand on the deadbolt. "Stay behind me," he said. He pulled the bolt. The wind, still strong, immediately shoved the door open with a groan. Finn did not wait. He bolted past Brandon's legs and into the gray, devastated landscape. He was a silver streak, disappearing into the tangle of downed branches, heading straight for the point. "Finn, wait! Damn it!" Brandon followed, leaning into the wind which tried to shove him back. The path was gone, buried under a foot of mud and debris. He stumbled, catching himself on the slick, torn trunk of a fallen alder. The air was full of the roar of the ocean, a sound far greater than the wind. It was the sound of mountains of water, displaced by the storm, now crashing into the island. He followed the dog, his heart pounding a heavy, tactical rhythm. He forced his legs to move toward the one place he did not want to be. He broke through the last line of trees and onto the rocky ledge. The sight made him stop dead. The ocean was a living, breathing monster. Waves, easily the size of a two-story building, were exploding against the black basalt, sending plumes of white, atomized spray 50 feet into the air. The sound was a physical, concussive force, so loud he could feel it in his teeth. Finn was at the very edge of the cliff, barking wildly, his paws slipping on the wet rock, his gaze fixed on the chaos below. "Get back!" Brandon yelled, lunging forward and grabbing the dog's scruff, hauling him away from the slippery edge. But Finn fought him, twisting, trying to get back, his barks frantic, directed at something in the surf. Brandon's blood ran cold. She came. She was foolish enough to come. He peered into the churning gray-green water. His eyes scanned the debris, logs, branches, seaweed. He saw nothing. "What is it, boy? What do you see?" He unclipped the heavy flashlight. Even in the dawn light, the beam was necessary to cut through the thick, salty spray. He played it over the water. Nothing. Then he saw it. It wasn't a boat. It was the memory of a boat. Jammed into a crevice between two massive boulders at the base of the cliff was a splintered section of white fiberglass. He could just make out a few blue letters. Iktis, Ika. It was Jessica's boat, or what was left of it. She had tried to cross. In that. In this. He swept the light over the wreckage again, his stomach hollowing out. He was looking for a body. He was looking for what was left. But Finn was not barking at the wreckage. He was barking at a spot lower down, a dark cleft in the rocks, just above the reach of all but the largest waves. "Stay," Brandon commanded, his voice a low growl. He scrambled down the slick face of the rock, his boots finding impossible holds. The spray was ice cold, blinding him. He reached the cleft, a dark, protected fissure in the basalt. He aimed his flashlight into the darkness. She was there. It was Jessica. She was wedged between the two boulders, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. She was unmoving. Her face was a pale, bluish white, her dark hair plastered like seaweed across her cheek. She was half submerged in a deep pool of frigid water that had been trapped by the tide. Brandon stared, the beam of his flashlight holding steady on her still, small face. The only sounds were the deafening roar of the ocean and the high-pitched, echoing, frantic barks of the dog on the cliff above him. He had found her. The beam from Brandon's flashlight cut a stark white circle against the darkness of the rock cleft. Jessica was not moving. Her body was wedged, her face pale and partially submerged in the trapped, icy water. She was not floundering. She was still. This stillness was worse than any scream. Brandon stood frozen on the slick ledge, the sound of the ocean a deafening, concussive roar all around him. He stared at the pale face, the dark hair plastered across her skin, the unnatural angle of her body. And the image in the flashlight beam began to waver. It was no longer Jessica's face. It was Joseph's. He was not in a rock cleft. He was in the water, tangled in the lines of the capsized trawler. The water was black, not gray-green. The light was not his flashlight. It was the harsh, swinging floodlight from the cutter's deck. "I see him!" he heard himself yell, but the words were stolen by the wind. He was paralyzed. His feet were bolted to the basalt. This was the moment. The exact moment he had relived 10,000 times. The moment of failure. He was the observer, trapped in his own memory, forced to watch the inevitable happen all over again. He failed. He is going to fail. Finn, on the cliff above him, was barking, a high-pitched, desperate sound that barely cut through the wall of noise from the surf. But Brandon did not hear him. He heard the high-pitched, agonizing whine of the helicopter. He heard the sharp, metallic snap of the winch bracket. He heard the roar of the water as it claimed his friend. "Joseph!" he screamed, but the name was silent, trapped in his paralyzed throat. And then the world exploded. A rogue wave, born from the storm's dark heart, rose up from the sea. It did not just crash against the cliff, it consumed it. A wall of solid, freezing water slammed into Brandon, knocking him from his feet. He felt his head strike the rock, and the flashlight was ripped from his hand, extinguishing the world. The wave surged into the cleft, and with a terrible, sucking sound, it pulled Jessica's limp body free from the rocks. When Brandon scrambled to his feet, gasping, the world was a spray-filled, gray chaos. The trapped pool was empty. He saw her. For a brief, terrible second, she was there, buoyant in the churning water, tossed like a piece of driftwood, her arm brushing against the splintered wreckage of her boat. She was in the open, swirling water now, floundering. The sight broke him. The paralysis returned, absolute. This was the moment. Joseph, slipping from his grasp, his hand reaching, slick with ice and spray, failing to find purchase. "No," he whispered, his body shaking, his back pressed against the cliff wall. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He was useless. He was a coward. He had failed then, and he was failing now. "I can't," he choked out, his vision tunneling, the world dissolving into the face of his lost friend. Above him, Finn was frantic. His barks had become agonizing shrieks. He scrambled down the rock face, his claws finding impossible holds, until he was on the same narrow ledge as Brandon. The dog shoved his wet body against Brandon's legs, barking, trying to get his attention. Brandon did not respond. He was gone, lost in the icy water of the past. Finn, sensing the complete failure of his warning, did the only thing his instinct told him to do. He reared up, and with a desperate, mournful growl, he bit down. The teeth clamped onto Brandon's forearm, through the thick oilskin, through the plaid shirt, and into the flesh. The pain was electric. It was sharp, grounding, and absolutely real. It was not the memory. It was not the cold. It was the sharp, physical, present-tense agony of a dog's teeth in his arm. Brandon roared, a sound of pure shock. He looked down. Finn was still latched on, his eyes wild, pulling, dragging him. The dog was not attacking him. He was anchoring him. He was pulling him back from the past, back to the present. The paralysis shattered, replaced by a sudden, violent surge of pure, desperate rage. It was not anger at the dog. It was rage at the ocean, at the memory, at Joseph for dying, and at himself for letting him. He ripped his arm free from the dog's mouth. He looked at the churning water. He saw Jessica, her dark hair disappearing beneath a wave. "No!" he screamed, the word tearing from his throat, a raw, primal defiance. He looked at the sky, at the storm, at the memory of his friend. "Not this time, Joseph." He was no longer a victim. He was a soldier. He was an EOD tech. He was a rescuer. He scrambled up the cliff face, past Finn, back to the spot where he had dropped his gear. The rope. He grabbed the coil, his hands no longer shaking, but moving with the blinding speed of pure muscle memory. He found the base of a thick, deep-rooted fir tree that had survived the wind. He ran the rope around it, his fingers tying a bowline, a knot he could tie in his sleep, in the dark, underwater. He cinched it tight, gave it one single, violent pull, and knew it would hold. He looped the other end around his chest, under his arms, securing it with a second knot. He didn't pause. He didn't second-guess. He ran to the edge of the cliff. He looked down at the spot where Jessica had vanished. He took one breath, and he jumped. The impact with the water was like hitting concrete. The cold was a physical blow, stealing every ounce of air from his lungs, a cold so profound it felt like burning. The undertow seized him immediately, trying to smash him against the barnacle-encrusted rocks. He ignored it. He fought the water, his arms and legs pumping, his eyes straining through the salt spray. He was no longer fighting the ocean. He was fighting his own ghost. He saw her, a flash of dark clothing just beneath the surface. He dove, kicking hard, and grabbed a handful of her jacket. He surfaced, gasping, pulling her with him. She was limp, a dead weight. His heart seized. No, not again. He got his arm around her chest in a cross-chest carry, the way he had been trained. He held her head above the water. "I have you!" he yelled at the storm. "I have you!" He looked up at the cliff. Finn was there, a silver shadow against the gray sky, barking, a beacon in the chaos. Brandon began to kick, pulling himself and his precious cargo back toward the cliff, fighting the current, his arm aching from the dog's bite, his lungs on fire from the cold. He felt the rope go taut, his anchor holding fast. He fought the water for what felt like an eternity, but it was only a minute. He reached the base of the cliff, the water still trying to tear her from his grasp. He found a foothold. He began to climb, one-handed, dragging her with him, his body screaming in protest. He reached the narrow ledge where he had first found her, the cleft now empty. He scrambled in, hauling her out of the main surf, and collapsed against the back wall, his grip on her still unbreakable. He had not let go. He had not let go. He was shaking, bleeding, and half-frozen, but he had her. He had won. Brandon's world had compressed to the size of the rock cleft. filled with the roar of the ocean and the impossible, fragile weight of the woman in his arms. Jessica was unconscious, her skin a terrifying waxy white, her lips blue. But he had felt it, a shallow, fluttering breath against his cheek. She was alive. That single, fragile sign of life was the signal. It cut through his exhaustion, through the fog of his own trauma. His victory on the ledge meant nothing if he failed on the path. Above him, Finn was a frantic, silver-gray shadow, barking, his calls almost human in their desperation, echoing off the rocks. "I'm coming, I have her," Brandon yelled, though he knew the dog couldn't understand his words, only the intent. He had to get her back to the cabin. The storm was still a living thing, the wind a solid wall of force, and the rain had turned to stinging, icy sleet. He was bleeding, his forearm a dull, throbbing ache where Finn had bitten him. He unclipped himself from the main rope, his fingers numb and clumsy. He looked at the path he had scrambled down. It was suicide to try it carrying a body. He looked up at the cliff he had descended. The rope was his only way. He secured Jessica in the cleft, as protected as possible. "Hold on," he whispered to her still face. He hauled himself up the rope, his muscles screaming. He reached the top, his breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. Finn was there, circling him, whining, nudging his hand. "Stay," Brandon commanded. He worked quickly, his mind clear, his training fully engaged. He re-rigged the rope, creating a crude hauling system, anchoring it again. He climbed back down, secured Jessica to the line, and then climbed up a final time. He braced his feet against the root of the tree. "Haul!" he yelled to himself and began to pull. It was dead weight, heavy with seawater. He pulled, hand over hand, his body a simple machine, ignoring the pain. Finn barked with every pull, a rhythmic, encouraging sound. Finally, she was at the top. He unhooked her and, without pausing to rest, got his shoulder under her middle, locking his arm around her knees. He stood. The world swayed, but his legs held. He began the journey back to the cabin. It was not a walk. It was a fight. The path was a river of mud and debris. He slipped, fell to one knee, but never let go. Finn ran ahead, then back, a frantic silver guide, clearing small branches with his body, showing the way. It felt like 1,000 years. When the cabin finally appeared through the driving sleet, Brandon was moving on pure, raw instinct. He kicked the door open. It slammed against the wall. He half fell, half stumbled inside, and collapsed onto the floor, carefully rolling Jessica's body onto the dry floorboards. He lay there for a single second, gasping, the world a black, spinning vortex. No, fire. He crawled to the fireplace. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely strike the match. The first one snapped, the second sputtered and died. His tactical mind screamed at him. Hypothermia. She has minutes. He took a deep breath, the one he always took before disarming a device. He forced his hands to be still. He struck the third match, a steady, perfect flame. He touched it to the tinder he had prepared days ago. A small curl of smoke, then a bright, greedy pop as the kindling caught. He added larger pieces, his movements precise. The fire roared to life, a beacon of orange against the gray despair. He turned to Jessica. Her skin was ice. His training took over. This was no longer Jessica, the artist, the neighbor. This was the mission. This was a body, a system on the verge of collapse. He grabbed his medical kit. His shears made a dull, snipping sound as he cut through the layers of her wet, heavy clothing, the jacket, the sweater, the shirt. It was clinical, impersonal. He cut everything away, his gaze analytical, noting the deep purple bruises, the bluish tint of her skin. He grabbed the dry wool blankets from his own bunk. He wrapped her tightly, swaddling her, then pulled his own cot mattress closer to the hearth. He rolled her onto it. He rubbed her extremities, hard, trying to force circulation, fighting the ice that had claimed her. He worked. He was a machine. Finn had entered the cabin behind him. The dog was not shaking. He was not afraid of the storm anymore. He stood near the door, his fur dripping, his gaze locked on Brandon. When Brandon finished wrapping Jessica, Finn moved. The dog did not go to Christopher's empty rocking chair. He walked to the hearth, his claws clicking softly on the floor. He lay down on the floorboards between the rocking chair Brandon now occupied and the mattress where Jessica lay. He let out a long, heavy sigh, placed his head on his paws, and watched them both. His watch had changed. He was no longer guarding a memory. He was guarding the living. Brandon finally looked at his own arm. He unwrapped the soaked plaid. The dog's bite was deep, 4 clean punctures. He deserved it. The dog had done his job. He had broken through. He went to the sink, poured clean water over the wound, hissing as it stung. He cleaned it with antiseptic from his kit and wrapped it tightly with a white gauze bandage. He slumped into Joshua's rocking chair, the one opposite Christopher's. He was too tired to move, too wired to sleep. The cabin was a wreck. Mud, seawater, and his own blood stained the floor. His perfect, controlled sanctuary was destroyed. He sat, the dog lay. The woman slept. Outside, the storm still howled, but its power was broken. It was no longer an assault, it was a retreat. Hours passed. The only sounds were the crackle and hiss of the fire and the steady, deep breathing of the dog. Then, a new sound. A low moan. Brandon was on his feet instantly. Jessica's eyes were fluttering. She was disoriented, her gaze unfocused. She saw the rough wooden ceiling. She felt the warmth of the fire. She saw the man, the hermit from the island, his face grim, his arm bandaged. Her eyes widened in terror. "Where?" "You're safe," Brandon said. His voice was a harsh croak. "You're in the cabin, Joshua's cabin." Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the silver-gray form by the fire. "Finn?" she whispered. Her voice was a dry rasp. Finn's head lifted. He whined, thumped his tail once on the floor, and rose. He walked to the mattress and nudged her hand, the one that was outside the blanket. Jessica's hand, weak and trembling, closed on his fur. "Oh, Finn," she sobbed, the tears weak. "You're okay." "He found you," Brandon said, his voice quiet. He dipped a tin cup into the water bucket and held it to her lips. She drank greedily. What happened?" she whispered, her memories a dark, watery chaos. "Your boat," Brandon said. "It's gone. The storm. It threw you on the rocks. Finn. Finn came and got me." She looked from the dog to the man. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the dried blood on his cheek where he had struck the rock, the fresh bandage on his arm. She saw the rope burns on his hands as he held the cup. I was so worried about him," she said, her voice breaking. "I knew the tide. I thought I could make it. "You were a fool," Brandon said. The words were not cruel. They were just a statement of fact. "I know," she whispered. You saved me." Brandon looked at the fire. He thought of the moment on the cliff, the teeth in his arm, the absolute, paralyzing fear. He looked at Finn, who was now resting his heavy head on the edge of Jessica's mattress. "He saved you," Brandon said. "Then he saved me. I think we saved each other." They sat in silence for a long time. The storm was just a low moan now, a distant dying animal. The fire crackled. Fire! The silence in the cabin was broken. It was no longer the empty, sterile silence of Brandon's isolation. It was a new quiet, one filled with the soft breathing of a sleeping dog and the shared, fragile pulse of 2 people who should have been dead. They were 3 survivors. The storm did not end. It dissolved. When Brandon awoke from a fitful, adrenaline-spent sleep in Joshua's rocking chair, the world was steeped in an eerie, profound silence. The only sound was the crackle of the dying embers in the fireplace. He was instantly alert. Jessica was still asleep on the mattress, her breathing shallow but even. Finn lay by her side, his head on his paws, but his eyes were open, watching Brandon. Brandon stood, his body screaming in protest, every muscle a dull, throbbing ache. He walked to the window. The world was washed clean. The sky was a pale, high, cloudless blue. The sun was brilliant, glinting off a million puddles and a sea that was, once again, a calm, deep green. The devastation was stark in the bright light, a graveyard of broken trees and scattered rocky debris. He looked at the strait. The tide was out. The sandbar was there, a wide, glistening path of wet sand, looking as peaceful and solid as a country road. "Jessica," he said, his voice a low croak. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked weak, pale, and bruised, but the hazy confusion of the night was gone. She was focused. "Is it over?" she whispered. "It's over," Brandon said. He went to the kitchen counter, found a protein bar from his supplies, and handed it to her along with the tin cup of water. "Eat. We have to move. You need a doctor." She didn't argue. She ate slowly, her hands shaking. My arm. I think it's broken." Brandon looked. In the light, he could see her left wrist was swollen, a dark, ugly purple. He had been so focused on the hypothermia, he hadn't seen it. "I need to get you to the clinic," he said, his tone flat, all mission. He found his dry plaid shirt, the one from his duffel bag, not the one ruined by the sea, and tore it into strips. He found 2 straight, solid pieces of kindling. With the same impersonal, efficient movements as the night before, he set her arm, lashing the splints in place. She winced, tears welling, but did not cry out. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I think so," she said. It took 10 minutes for them to prepare. Brandon packed his small first aid kit and the rope. He helped Jessica to her feet. She was unsteady, leaning heavily on him. Finn, seeing them move toward the door, stood, his body alert, ready. Brandon opened the door to the new world. The air was cold, sharp, and clean. The 3 of them stepped out onto the porch. The rocking chairs were still there, untouched. But the cabin was different. Its seal of isolation had been broken, its sanctuary violated, and then, strangely, redefined. The walk to the sandbar was slow. Jessica leaned on Brandon, her good arm thrown over his shoulder. He took her weight, his body solid, his gaze sweeping the path, assessing, just as he had done in the field. Finn walked beside them, no longer a frantic scout, but a quiet, steady escort. When they reached the sandbar, the symbolism was impossible to miss. This was Finn's path, his pilgrimage to the past. Now they were walking it together, away from the island, toward the future. The crossing was quiet. The only sounds were the distant cry of gulls and the squelch of their boots in the wet sand. When they reached the main island, a few people, islanders emerging to check the damage, saw them. They saw the tall, grim man in the flannel shirt, his arm wrapped in a bloody bandage, supporting the pale, battered artist, with the old silver-gray dog limping faithfully beside them. No one spoke, but a path was cleared. The island clinic was a small white building attached to the post office. Brandon pushed the door open. A woman in bright blue scrubs looked up from a desk, her face a mask of competence. She had short, graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. This was Nurse Megan. "My God," Megan said, her voice calm, taking in the scene. She was on her feet instantly. "Get her in here. What happened?" "Boat capsized in the storm," Brandon said, his voice flat, all report. "Hypothermia, possible broken arm, head trauma. She was in the water for an unknown amount of time." Megan's eyes snapped to his. She took in his bandaged arm, the rope burns on his hands, the exhaustion. "I'm Brandon, from Joshua's place. This is Jessica. She needs help." "You did this?" Megan asked, pointing to the splint as she guided Jessica to an examination table. "Yes." "And the hypothermia?" "I got her out, got the wet clothes off, blankets, fire." Megan nodded, her gaze sharp, assessing him now. She took her stethoscope and listened to Jessica's lungs. She checked her pulse. "Your first aid. It saved her life, Mr. Brandon. A few more minutes in that water. Well, let's get her warm." She worked with an efficiency Brandon respected. She wrapped Jessica in thermal blankets, started an IV, and confirmed the arm was almost certainly broken. She was gentle, her voice a low, reassuring murmur to Jessica. Finn lay by the door, his head on his paws, watching, satisfied that the transfer of care was complete. Brandon stood awkwardly by the wall, his mission over. He was no longer a rescuer. He was just a man in a room, and he suddenly felt out of place. "You should let me look at that arm," Megan said, pointing at his bandage. "It's nothing," Brandon said. "It's a dog bite," Jessica whispered from the table. He bit him. To save me." Megan's eyebrows shot up. She looked at the dog, then at Brandon. "You three have a story, don't you?" she said. "It needs to be cleaned. Properly. Sit." He sat. He let her clean the wound. His duty was done. Chamuri. Weeks passed. The island began to heal. The scar of the storm faded. Brandon, with a grim determination, repaired the damage to his cabin. He rehung the shutter. He cleared the path. He even salvaged Jessica's splintered boat, though he knew it was beyond repair. His routine returned, but it was altered. He still woke to the sound of the ocean, but the sound no longer held the same suffocating power over him. It was just the ocean. One afternoon, in the bright, cold light of November, he was sitting on the porch, sanding a piece of driftwood he'd found. He was trying to repair the arm of Christopher's rocking chair, which had been cracked by a falling branch. He heard a sound, a familiar click of claws on rock. He looked up. The tide was out. The sandbar was clear. Finn was there, but he was not alone. Jessica walked beside him. She was no longer pale. Her color returned. Her arm was in a bright blue cast, but she moved with her old energy. They walked up the path. Finn trotted ahead, his tail giving one soft wag. He did not go to Christopher's chair. He went to Brandon and nudged his hand, the one with the fresh pink scars. "Hello, Brandon," Jessica said, her voice clear in the quiet air. "Jessica." He nodded, stopping his work. She smiled. I brought you something." She held out a small paper bag. It was from the mercantile. Coffee. The good kind. "Thank you," he said, taking it. She motioned to the second chair, Christopher's chair. "May I?" I'm fixing it," he said, awkward. "It looks sturdy enough," she said. She sat down, settling in, as if she belonged there. Brandon returned to Joshua's chair. The three of them sat together, a comfortable silence settling between them. Finn lay down, his body a bridge between the two chairs, his head resting on Brandon's boot. They watched the water. They watched the gulls. In the distance, the afternoon ferry, heading for Friday Harbor, passed across the strait. It let out a long, deep, resonant horn blast, a sound that vibrated through the air, across the water, and into the wood of the porch. Brandon flinched. It was not a large movement, but it was sharp. His shoulders tensed, his spine went rigid, and his hand tightened on the arm of the chair, his knuckles turning white. The sound, that deep, metallic, vibrating sound. It was the sound of the winch bracket. It was the sound of the hull. It was the sound of the memory. He was back on the deck, the water churning. Jessica saw it. She saw the tension, the faraway look in his eyes. She did not speak. She did not ask if he was okay. She simply reached over, her hand warm, and placed it gently on his white-knuckled arm, just above the bandage. A simple, grounding touch. At the same moment, Finn, sensing the sudden tension in the man above him, lifted his heavy head and nudged his muzzle firmly against Brandon's other hand. The contact was immediate. One touch, warm and human. The other, steady and animal. Brandon's rigid shoulders softened. He let out a breath he had been holding, a long, slow sigh. The sound of the ferry horn faded, replaced by the feeling of the hand on his arm and the pressure of the dog's head on his hand. He was not on the cutter. He was on a porch. He was not alone. He looked at Jessica, and she smiled, a small, knowing smile. He looked down at Finn, who looked back up at him with calm, intelligent eyes. Brandon nodded, a short, almost imperceptible movement. He was not cured. The ghosts were still there, still waiting in the dark water. But they no longer had power. He had anchors now. He turned his gaze back to the sea, and for the first time in his life, he felt. at peace. The strongest anchors in our lives are not made of iron, but of loyalty. Brandon was a man trapped by the echoes of his past, but the unwavering devotion of a dog helped pull him back to the present. Finn and Jessica showed him that healing does not mean we forget what we lost. It means finding a new reason to hold on. If you were moved by their story of survival and connection, please consider sharing it with someone you know. We truly read every one of your comments and value your thoughts. We hope you will subscribe and become part of our community. And your next story from Veteran Dog Tales is already waiting for you, right on the screen.